Hari Om friends, this is Yogeshwar Shastri and welcome to the fourth part of the series on the British revenue extortion in Bharat. So in this series, as you know by now, I have taken Tirunelveli district in Tamil Nadu as a case study because my article is based on that. So I do recommend that you go and read the article, which is very detailed and it has got a lot of data analysis. And I've given a link in the description as usual. So let's get started. So in the last episode, we had a look at the pre-British revenue systems in Bharat, the Hindu revenue systems. Okay, and we understood that revenue was taken in kind, which is a share of the produce, not in cash. So farmers weren't forced to convert, at harvest times when typically you get low prices because there's a glut on the market, and they even if there was a drought and the amount of produce went down, their the share they had to give to the government or the rulers proportionately went down. And sometimes when the situation was really dire, maybe there was a famine looming, then the government or the rulers would say, okay, we don't want the share, you guys keep it so you can survive. So troubled times started for especially Tirunelveli district once large parts of Tamil Nadu went under these Nawabs of various persuasions. So these Nawabs were really flotsam from the debris of the Mughal Empire, which had pretty much collapsed after the Marathas gave it a hammering. So all the local governors kind of found their own piece of land or piece of country, and then they made themselves Nawabs. So the first kind of person to do that was Dost Ali Khan, who kind of betrayed the last queen of Madurai, and then he became the Nawab of what was known as Carnatic by the British. And this went on till the Nawabs of Arcot, of the most notable who was Muhammad Ali Khan Walaja, who took over Tirunelveli around 1749. So these Nawabs are with whom we are really concerned now. And what they did was, now you remember that I told you in the last episode that polygars, or the polygars as the British call them, were the main sources of resistance to the tyrannical revenue collection. So what this Nawab did was he appointed a type of tax collector known as a renter. Okay, and these renters were responsible for collecting the revenue from the polygars and the villages which did not come under polygar rule. So not all villages were under polygars; they were pretty autonomous, independent. And during the 62-year rule of the Nawab, roughly going into early 1800s when the British formally took over the district, there were roughly around 26 renters. So a succession of renters. Just like you have got the collectors of a district. So a collector might stay for 3 years, then there's a second, then there's third, and so on. So you had one renter who, depending on how good or how efficient or inefficient he was, he stayed for a certain length of time and then the next renter came in. So this went on for 62 years and 26 renters. And the last few renters were really British officials who became collectors themselves. And some of the characteristics of renters were extortion. So they extorted over 80% of the produce from farmers by means of torture. Okay, forced labor. So if you look at my series on forced labor, you will understand what forced labor is. So forced labor is basically being forced to work for free for government works. So building canals, roads, buildings, maintenance or whatever it is, being worked to force for free, but you're also paying tax at the same time. So it's kind of a double whammy. And farmers were forced to repair tanks, canals, river embankments, etc. for free. And this was institutionalized later on during British rule. Asset grabbing. So everything that the farmer had, house, land, woman, everything could be grabbed by the renters. Okay. Torture, yeah. And if the farmer, for whatever reason, reaped the harvest without the renter's permission, so an army of peons would descend and beat the living daylights out of the farmers, and obviously horrible tortures were also done. So I have got episode on torture in my forced labor series. So do go and have a look, and I'll put the link. So I'm not still not sophisticated enough to point upwards and then you can see the link. So I'll get to that point sometime. And Sarkar or Sirkar or the government had the first right of sale on produce. So what they used to do initially was, if the farmers couldn't pay in cash, they would still take in kind. So they would take a part of produce, but then they would prohibit the farmers from selling it. So the government, the Muslim government or the British government would hold the grain. The farmers wouldn't be able to sell it. So there was this artificial scarcity on the market. And once prices shot up, the government would offload all its grain. So the East India Company or the Nawab would offload all the grain, and they would make massive profits. And there was a glut on the market after that. So whatever the farmers had to sell, they would have to sell at a very heavy loss. And toll taxes. So now remember, we are talking way before the automobiles time, where transport was by bullock carts, and it was obviously quite slow. So if a farmer had to sell at the district markets, and this was quite a task before you had the internal combustion engine and automobiles, distances were very formidable. So he would have to pay a toll tax every 10 miles. And to give an example, between Nagapattinam and Palakkad Fort, which is a distance of roughly 400 kilometers, there were more than 30 such toll booths. So yeah, pretty much extortion at every stage. And the renters, and again the East India Company and the British government did this pretty much after that, they used to cause localized famine by hoarding grain, prohibiting its sale and selling at exorbitant prices during scarcity. And this is what I mentioned. It's linked to the Sarkar having the first right on sale of produce. And in case the people resisted the tyranny, typically Paligars or the villages were not completely disarmed even by this point. So it was really 1850s and afterwards that Indians were completely disarmed. And then the Gandhian principles of bogus non-violence were foisted on them. So the renter would call for military backup, probably from the nearest barracks or garrison where you had the European and their native collaborators. So this was the characters of renters. And once I go into further episodes where I discuss the different means adopted by the British to extract revenue, the British were renters on a very grand scale. And see, later British gazetteers, they used to kind of heap opprobrium on the renters, saying these were a parasitical breed and this and that and the other, while completely being oblivious to the fact that they were actually worse than the renters. And so finally in 1781, the company Bahadur, or as East India Company was known at that point of time, it got the right to collect revenue from the Nawab. See, because these Nawabs and even the Nizam, they used to borrow a lot of money from the British and the French to keep their wars going and to sustain their kingdoms. So they ran into huge debts to the East India Company, and often the debt was given out at extortionate rates. So they are pretty much just kind of rubber stamps. It was really the East India Company and the British government which was controlling them. The company, for all practical purposes, became the ruler of the region, and the company appointed another category of tax collectors called the receivers. So this particular species was above the renter in the food chain, and what they used to do was, the renters were not performing, they used to be dismissed, and the receiver used to take full control of the district. So this kind of continued till 1790, when the renters were permanently kind of abolished or eliminated from the food chain, and the receivers took control. And 1800 was, within 9 years, was when the company appointed the first collector of the district, whose name I think was Lushington. So just a kind of aside, okay, so from Hindi movies, especially if you watch the movies of the 50s, 60s and even 70s, so this zamindar is shown as the evil kind of womanizer, land grabbing, torture mating kind of person. But you have to understand that before mid 1800s, before 1830s, the zamindars which existed were of a different kind and a different breed. And what came after the 1800s or 1830s was a very different breed. So the kind of zamindar you see portrayed as a villain in the Hindi movies is really a British creation. Okay, but by 1890s, the original class of zamindars had been pretty much been destroyed by the British, and everywhere they had been replaced by this blood-sucking parasitical class, who, like I said, is a Hindi movie stereotype. So the nature of the zamindars of the pre-British era and the initial decades of the British era is illustrated by a comment by a Tahsildar called Chentasad Rao. Now, Chentasar Rao has been quoted in quite a famous book by Raghava Iyengar, who was a civil servant, and he rose to a very high position in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And he wrote a very voluminous book. It's available from Internet Archive. Again, I forgot its name. I've got the digital copy of it. I think Memorandum of Progress in Madras Presidency. That was the name of the book. So he recounts this incident that Chentasal Rao told Raghavengar, who was writing in 1893, that my grandfather once told me that when he was a Tahsildar, the collector having on one occasion called him to expedite the revenue collection and intimated that if he did not remit at least rupees 50,000 within a week, he would be dismissed. So Chentasal Rao is talking about his grandfather. Now Chentasal Rao was probably 1880s, 1890s. So his grandfather would probably have been early 1800s. Okay. So if that time, you have to remember 50,000 rupees was a very, very, very big sum of money. And the Tahsildar was threatened that if he didn't pay 50,000 within a week, the collector would dismiss him from his job. So what happened afterwards is very interesting. A single Rayat or a farmer paid all the money in advance and received it afterwards from the Rayats in his taluk. So received from the farmers of his taluk. Such men of wealth and influence over the Rayats do not now exist. So he's writing this in 1893. So you have to understand that, you know, the zamindars which were pre-British or even early British years were of a very different kind. Their estates were broken up by the British. Now these estates were huge, 40,000 acres, 80,000 acres, so massive estates, and they were broken up by British collectors because the British collectors made a lot of money. So they were as corrupt as anybody else. So they used to have their commission and they used to sell it at very low prices to other Indians who used to pay them money basically. So as corrupt as can be. Okay, so that's it for this time, and in the next episode we will have a look at the first British wealth extraction system which they implemented in Tirunelveli district, and there are different systems, so we'll go through each of them. Okay friends, so this is all for this time. I hope you liked the video. So if you have liked it, please don't remember to like, share and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Hari Om.